Illegal images found on accused killer David Anthony Burke's cell phone. Los Angeles County Deputy District Attorney Beth Silverman claims the illegal images involving children were uncovered as part of a broad series of search warrants executed on Burke's phone and iCloud.
It's not about anyone else but him. He's not getting what he wants. He's not getting his time. So really, it's really indicative of the behavior that took place leading up to this poor girl's death. She was perceived as a possession, not a person.
It's the pinky and the left ring finger were mutilated. Also, there were fragments, tiny fragments of blue plastic material in the cuts.
This is not a capital case. It might be on paper, but this young man has absolutely no criminal record. I do not see a jury ever executing him. I think best case scenario is that this could result in a plea bargain.
The case had already shocked investigators. A young woman was dead. A musician, barely old enough to legally drink, stood accused of first-degree murder. And for months, many of the most disturbing details remained hidden behind sealed court records and tightly controlled investigative filings. But as prosecutors slowly began revealing what they claim was uncovered during the investigation into the death of Celeste Rivas Hernandez, the case transformed from a tragic homicide into something far darker, more complicated, and deeply unsettling. According to prosecutors, investigators executing search warrants on the phone and iCloud account of David Anthony Burke uncovered disturbing digital evidence that immediately expanded the scope of the case. Around the same time, court proceedings revealed that investigators had also used a wiretap during the investigation, an extraordinary measure typically reserved for cases where law enforcement believes critical conversations may still be taking place behind the scenes. Then came the autopsy findings. Stab wounds, mutilation, tiny fragments of blue plastic embedded in injuries on Celeste's body. Details so graphic and disturbing that even experienced commentators who had reviewed homicide investigations for years publicly admitted they struggled to process what they had read. And through all of it, Burke appeared in court calm, restrained, and largely emotionless. Before we go any further, if you appreciate detailed and carefully researched true crime coverage, make sure you like this video and subscribe to Crime Case Analyst. This case continues to evolve with every hearing, every filing, and every new disclosure, and will continue following every major development as more information becomes public. To understand why this investigation has captured so much public attention, it is necessary to understand not only the allegations prosecutors are presenting, but also the emotional core of the case itself. At the center of all of this was Celeste Rivas Hernandez, a young woman whose life has increasingly become overshadowed by the horrifying circumstances surrounding her death. In many high-profile criminal investigations, public focus eventually shifts almost entirely toward the accused. Courtroom appearances, psychological analysis, digital evidence, and speculation often dominate headlines until the victim slowly disappears from the narrative. But in this case, the prosecution's presentation repeatedly returns to one central argument: that Celeste was treated not as a person with autonomy and identity, but allegedly as a possession. That framing has become one of the defining themes of the investigation. As investigators began piecing together the timeline leading up to Celeste's death, prosecutors and commentators alike pointed toward what they described as a deeply unhealthy dynamic surrounding the relationship at the center of the case. While many details remain disputed and the defense has firmly maintained Burke's innocence, the narrative being constructed by prosecutors paints a picture of escalating control, secrecy, emotional fixation, and ultimately, violence. David Anthony Burke, known publicly through his music persona, entered the spotlight of this case as a 21-year-old defendant facing allegations severe enough to immediately generate national attention. Court records and media coverage surrounding the investigation describe a young man who, at least publicly, maintained a creative identity tied to music and online culture. But investigators allegedly discovered evidence that caused prosecutors to widen their interpretation of the case beyond a single act of violence. The allegations concerning material reportedly found on Burke's devices became one of the earliest indicators that investigators believed there may have been broader behavioral patterns relevant to the homicide investigation. Importantly, prosecutors did not publicly claim that any illegal material found during the searches involved Celeste herself. That distinction matters both legally and ethically. But the revelation dramatically changed the public perception of the case because it suggested investigators were examining not merely the killing itself, but the larger psychological and behavioral environment surrounding the accused. As public attention intensified, courtroom proceedings became focal points for new revelations. One of the most striking aspects repeatedly noted by observers was Burke's demeanor during appearances before the judge. According to courtroom accounts, he appeared calm, composed, and at times almost detached from the gravity of the allegations surrounding him. Wearing an Orange County-issued jail uniform and appearing in restraints, Burke reportedly answered the judge briefly and directly. "Yes, ma'am." For many viewers following the case online, those small courtroom moments became psychologically loaded. People often search for emotion, remorse, fear, or panic in defendants facing major criminal charges. But demeanor in court is notoriously unreliable as evidence of guilt or innocence. Some defendants appear numb, others overcompensate emotionally. Some are heavily medicated. Some are trained by attorneys to remain expressionless. Still, in high-profile cases, the public inevitably interprets body language through the lens of the allegations themselves. And in this case, the allegations were becoming increasingly graphic. The autopsy report would eventually become one of the most discussed aspects of the investigation. For months, much of it remained sealed from public view. That secrecy alone generated speculation. In homicide investigations, autopsy reports are sometimes temporarily restricted to protect investigative integrity, prevent contamination of witness testimony, or avoid releasing details known only to investigators and the perpetrator. But when portions of Celeste's autopsy findings finally emerged publicly, the reaction was immediate. According to the disclosed findings, Celeste suffered 2 stab wounds identified as potentially fatal. One reportedly penetrated through the intercostal space between the ribs. Another struck near the base of the rib cage and penetrated the liver. The report allegedly documented a downward angle of entry consistent with forceful stabbing motions. Those findings alone established the level of violence investigators believed had occurred. But additional details elevated the horror of the case even further. The report also allegedly documented mutilation involving Celeste's fingers, specifically the left ring finger and pinky. Embedded within the injuries, investigators reportedly discovered tiny fragments of blue plastic material. That detail became one of the most haunting mysteries in the case, because it immediately raised questions investigators have not publicly answered. What was the source of the plastic? Was it linked to a tool, a container, a restraint, a cleanup process, or something else entirely? At this stage, those questions remain unanswered publicly, and that uncertainty has become one of the investigation's strongest engines of suspense. The prosecution's broader theory of the case appears to rely not only on physical evidence, but also on behavioral interpretation. During media discussions surrounding the hearings, psychological experts brought in to analyze the publicly available information repeatedly emphasized themes of control, fantasy, and emotional detachment. One criminal justice psychologist described the alleged dynamic in stark terms, arguing that Celeste may have been viewed as an object rather than an independent human being. That psychological framing became central to how commentators interpreted nearly every new revelation. The body bag allegedly associated with the investigation became one of the most controversial examples. Commentators noted that the purchase or possession of such an item could potentially suggest preparation and premeditation, depending on the surrounding circumstances. But beyond the legal implications, analysts focused heavily on the symbolic implications. To many observers, the idea of a young man possessing a professional-style body bag appeared deeply disturbing in the context of the murder allegations. Psychological experts discussing the case suggested that the significance might extend beyond practicality. Some argued it pointed toward a fascination with death itself, not merely concealment after violence occurred. Whether that interpretation ultimately holds legal significance remains uncertain, but it undeniably shaped public perception of the case. Another major focus involved Burke's music and lyrics. Investigators and commentators repeatedly referenced lines from songs allegedly written or performed prior to Celeste's death. Lyrics discussing killing without remorse became particularly controversial once placed beside the homicide allegations. This created a difficult and complicated legal and ethical issue that appears in many criminal cases involving artists. Artistic expression alone is not evidence of criminal conduct. Musicians, filmmakers, writers, and actors frequently explore violent themes symbolically or fictionally. Courts are often extremely cautious about allowing artistic material to be interpreted as literal intent. Yet in the court of public opinion, context changes everything. Once the homicide allegations emerged, listeners began revisiting lyrics through an entirely different lens. Words that might once have sounded theatrical or provocative suddenly appeared chilling to some observers. Again, it is critical to distinguish interpretation from proof. The existence of violent lyrics does not establish guilt, but prosecutors and commentators alike appeared to believe the lyrics contributed to a larger portrait of emotional detachment and violent fantasy. As more details emerged, the investigation increasingly appeared to center around the question of escalation. Prosecutors seemed to suggest that what happened to Celeste was not spontaneous chaos, but the endpoint of a deteriorating dynamic involving secrecy, control, and mounting psychological pressure. One of the most significant developments supporting that theory was the revelation that investigators had used a wiretap during the investigation. Wiretaps are not casually approved. Law enforcement agencies typically must convince a judge that conventional investigative methods are insufficient and that there is probable cause to believe important criminal communications are taking place. That threshold is substantial. What remains unknown publicly is exactly who investigators were monitoring and what they allegedly captured. That uncertainty has fueled enormous speculation surrounding the case. Did investigators believe people were coordinating stories, concealing evidence, discussing disposal of remains, attempting to protect someone? At this stage, those questions remain unanswered publicly. But the mere existence of the wiretap suggested investigators believed the case potentially extended beyond isolated actions by a single individual. And as the investigation widened, the public's understanding of Burke himself became increasingly fragmented. On one side stood the defense position. Burke pleaded not guilty. His attorneys publicly pushed back against aspects of the prosecution's narrative and argued against interpretations they viewed as inflammatory or excessive. Legal analysts discussing the proceedings noted that the defense appeared prepared to challenge not only the evidence itself, but also the prosecution's attempt to psychologically characterize Burke in ways that might emotionally influence potential jurors. One defense attorney even suggested publicly that, despite the shocking nature of the allegations, the case might ultimately resolve through plea negotiations rather than a death penalty outcome. He pointed to Burke's lack of criminal history and questioned whether a jury would realistically support the harshest possible punishment. That legal strategy hinted at an important tension emerging beneath the surface of the case. Prosecutors appeared focused on constructing a narrative of predatory obsession and calculated violence. The defense, meanwhile, seemed positioned to emphasize youth, lack of prior convictions, and potential overreach in the prosecution's framing. This battle over narrative would likely become just as important as the physical evidence itself. True crime audiences are often drawn to mysteries because they seek answers. But some of the most compelling investigations are driven instead by contradictions. And few contradictions in this case were more striking than the difference between the brutality described in the autopsy findings and the reportedly calm demeanor Burke displayed while incarcerated awaiting trial. Commentators discussing the case repeatedly returned to reports that Burke complained about routine jail conditions, including recreation time and fresh air access. For some analysts, those complaints became psychologically symbolic. They argued the contrast suggested an intense self-focus, disconnected from the suffering prosecutors alleged had been inflicted on Celeste. Again, such interpretations remain subjective. Human behavior under criminal accusation varies enormously, but in the narrative structure surrounding this case, these moments were repeatedly used to reinforce the prosecution's broader theory of emotional detachment and narcissistic perspective. As investigators continued building their timeline, public fascination intensified around the period immediately preceding Celeste's death. According to analysts discussing the prosecution's theory, one possible motive investigators explored involved fears surrounding exposure of the relationship or loss of control within it. While prosecutors have not publicly laid out every detail of their motive theory, experts analyzing the available information repeatedly referenced emotional possession, fear of disruption, and collapse of fantasy narratives. The phrase, possession, not a person, became central because it distilled the prosecution's implied theory into a single emotionally devastating concept. According to psychologists discussing the case publicly, relationships rooted in extreme control can become dangerous when the controlling individual perceives independence, rejection, or exposure as existential threats. The concern investigators appeared to be examining was whether Celeste's autonomy itself may have triggered escalating fear or anger. Importantly, none of this substitutes for courtroom proof. Psychological interpretation cannot replace evidence. But in documentary storytelling, psychological framing often becomes the mechanism through which viewers emotionally process forensic facts. And the forensic facts themselves continued growing darker. The mention of blue plastic fragments embedded in Celeste's wounds remained one of the most disturbing unresolved details disclosed publicly. Unlike the stab wounds, which established direct violence, the plastic fragments implied interaction with another object or environment during or after the attack. The specificity of the detail made it unforgettable. It was not merely gruesome, it was mysterious. Mysteries anchor audience retention because they create unfinished mental loops, and investigators appeared to possess many answers they had not yet revealed publicly. That sense of withheld information became even more pronounced during court proceedings that many expected would produce dramatic witness testimony. Instead, one hearing largely functioned as a procedural status conference, delaying fuller evidentiary disclosures. Yet paradoxically, the absence of dramatic testimony intensified public curiosity, because each procedural update still introduced fragments of disturbing new information. This incremental release of evidence has become one of the defining characteristics of the case's media coverage. Rather than one massive disclosure, the investigation has unfolded through carefully revealed layers. First, the homicide allegations, then dismemberment implications, then digital evidence, then wiretap revelations, then autopsy details, then psychological analysis. Each layer reshaped the public understanding of the case, and through every phase, Celeste remained at the center of the tragedy. It is easy in complex investigations for victims to become reduced to evidence. Autopsy findings replace personality. Court filings replace identity. But behind every forensic detail in this case was a young woman whose family was forced to confront not only devastating loss, but also the horrifying public exposure of intimate and violent details surrounding her death. Families navigating high-profile homicide cases often experience a second trauma through media coverage itself. Each new hearing can reopen grief. Each released document can generate another wave of public discussion about the final moments of someone they loved. In this case, the emotional intensity surrounding the autopsy findings likely magnified that burden significantly. As national coverage expanded, the case also sparked broader discussions about digital evidence in modern homicide investigations. Increasingly, prosecutors build timelines not only through witness testimony and forensic analysis, but through cloud accounts, message histories, metadata, location records, online searches, photographs, and encrypted communications. Modern smartphones often function as behavioral archives, documenting patterns investigators later attempt to reconstruct. In this investigation, prosecutors' emphasis on search warrants executed across devices and cloud storage strongly suggested that digital reconstruction played a major role in their case development. At the same time, defense attorneys in digital-era prosecutions frequently challenge the interpretation of such evidence. Possession does not always establish intent. Searches do not necessarily prove action. Context becomes critical, and prosecutors must ultimately demonstrate not merely disturbing material or suspicious behavior, but legal responsibility for specific criminal acts beyond reasonable doubt. That distinction may eventually become central during trial proceedings. Yet, outside the courtroom, public imagination often races ahead of legal process. The combination of alleged violent lyrics, autopsy brutality, digital evidence, and wiretap revelations created a narrative almost cinematic in its darkness. But real investigations are rarely as neat as public narratives suggest. Cases evolve, evidence gets challenged, motives shift, witnesses contradict one another, and early theories sometimes collapse under scrutiny. For now, however, prosecutors appear confident that the evidence they have assembled supports their charges. One of the most haunting aspects of the case remains the apparent contrast between ordinary youth and extraordinary allegations. Burke was only 21 years old when he appeared in court, facing accusations that would permanently define public perception of him. That age has repeatedly become a point of discussion among commentators because it complicates how audiences emotionally process the case. Youth often carries assumptions of immaturity, impulsiveness, or possibility for change. But the allegations themselves describe violence so severe that many observers struggle to reconcile the defendant's age with the brutality investigators allege occurred. This tension between perceived normalcy and alleged horror sits at the heart of many modern true crime stories. Communities search for visible warning signs after catastrophic violence. They revisit social media posts, artistic work, relationships, and behavioral clues looking for evidence that danger was always present. Sometimes those clues appear obvious in retrospect. Other times they emerge only after people reinterpret ordinary behavior through the lens of tragedy. In this case, commentators repeatedly emphasized what they viewed as thematic consistencies surrounding death, emotional detachment, and violent imagery. Whether those interpretations ultimately withstand legal scrutiny remains uncertain, but they undeniably shaped the public narrative developing around the case. As prosecutors continued revealing portions of their evidence, another question quietly grew in importance. Why had so much of the autopsy information remained sealed for so long? There are practical investigative reasons for restricting sensitive forensic details, but analysts following the case increasingly suggested that the disturbing nature of the findings themselves may have contributed to the decision. Some commentators who reviewed the disclosed information publicly described feeling physically ill reading the report. Others called the findings explosive and exceptionally brutal, even by homicide investigation standards. Such reactions intensified public anticipation surrounding future hearings because many observers believed investigators still possessed additional, unreleased evidence. And then there was the unresolved issue of the wiretap. Wiretap investigations inherently imply unseen conversations. The public knows they occurred, but not what was said. That creates a uniquely powerful form of suspense, because audiences instinctively imagine hidden truths waiting behind sealed transcripts or undisclosed recordings. Did investigators hear panic, planning, deception, silence, attempts to coordinate stories, genuine grief? At this stage, the answers remain hidden from public view. But the existence of the wiretap changed the psychological scale of the investigation. Suddenly, the case no longer appeared limited to a violent encounter between two individuals. Instead, it hinted at networks, communication chains, and potentially broader awareness among people surrounding the accused. Whether prosecutors can ultimately substantiate those implications in court remains to be seen. What is already clear, however, is that the death of Celeste Rivas Hernandez has become far more than a routine homicide investigation. It has evolved into a case defined by layers of secrecy, disturbing forensic evidence, digital revelations, psychological interpretation, and unresolved questions that continue multiplying with every public disclosure. And perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all is how many critical questions remain unanswered. What exactly happened in the final hours before Celeste died? Why were blue plastic fragments embedded in injuries on her body? What conversations allegedly justified a judicially authorized wiretap? What evidence convinced investigators this case involved premeditation? And what information remains sealed from public view? Those questions continue hovering over every hearing, every filing, and every new development emerging from the courtroom. Because despite the graphic evidence already disclosed, investigators appear to believe the full story of what happened to Celeste Rivas Hernandez has still not been publicly told. And according to prosecutors, the evidence they plan to present next may deepen the case even further. If you've been following this investigation and want continued coverage as new hearings unfold, make sure you like this video and subscribe to Crime Case Analyst. The smallest detail in the entire investigation may ultimately become the most important. Not the courtroom appearances, not the disturbing lyrics that prosecutors and commentators have spent months debating, not even the body bag investigators allegedly connected to the case. Instead, it may come down to microscopic blue plastic fragments embedded deep inside wounds on the body of Celeste Rivas Hernandez. Tiny pieces of material so small they could only be identified through forensic examination, yet significant enough that investigators brought specialized criminalists directly into both the crime scene investigation and the autopsy itself. Now the focus was shifting towards something even more consequential. Prosecutors were no longer simply describing violence. They appeared to be constructing a scientific roadmap intended to connect injuries, tools, digital evidence, and physical trace material into one unified chain of accountability. And according to experts following the case, the evidence trail may be far more detailed than the public initially realized. The blue plastic fragments immediately became one of the most haunting mysteries in the entire investigation, because they suggested something investigators rarely discuss publicly unless they believe it matters enormously. Trace transfer. The microscopic exchange of material that occurs when people, objects, tools, and environments come into violent contact with one another. During public discussions surrounding the autopsy findings, forensic analysts explained that tissue samples collected during examinations are routinely analyzed under magnification to identify materials invisible to the naked eye. Fibers, paint, glass, plastic, biological residue. The purpose is simple but extraordinarily important. Violent acts often leave behind microscopic signatures, and in Celeste's case, investigators reportedly found tiny fragments of blue plastic embedded inside cuts on her body. What exactly that material represents remains publicly unresolved. But the fact that specialists immediately focused on it suggests investigators believe the fragments may be connected directly to an object involved in the crime itself. Forensic experts discussing the case publicly dismissed early speculation that the material came from surgical gloves. According to analysts, the report would likely have identified latex or rubberized residue differently if gloves were the source. Instead, the descriptions appearing in discussions around the autopsy pointed towards something firmer, something rigid enough to fragment during contact. That distinction changed everything, because if the plastic originated from a tool used during the attack or dismemberment process, investigators may eventually be able to trace the material back to a specific product, manufacturer, or instrument type. And once forensic investigations reach that stage, the case begins transforming from theory into reconstruction. According to analysts discussing the evidence, criminalists specializing in trace materials were physically present during both the recovery scene and the autopsy itself. That level of forensic involvement is significant. It suggests investigators recognized early on that microscopic evidence might become critically important later in court. The process now unfolding behind the scenes is likely painstaking and methodical. Experts explained that the fragments would first be visually examined, then analyzed under microscopes, then potentially subjected to chemical composition testing. Investigators may attempt to determine not only what the fragments are made of, but whether they are consistent with components used in specific commercial products. If the fragments can be linked to a certain type of saw, cutting instrument, or tool housing, the implications could become enormous. Because forensic investigations rarely rely on one single discovery. Instead, they build chains. Plastic fragments may point toward a tool type. A tool type may point toward a manufacturer. A manufacturer may point toward a product line. A product line may point toward a purchase, and a purchase may point toward a person. That is the direction many analysts believe this investigation is moving. At the same time, Experts examining the publicly released information have repeatedly emphasized that investigators appear to believe more than one instrument was involved in the violence inflicted on Celeste. According to forensic discussions surrounding the autopsy findings, the stab wounds themselves were likely caused by a sharp blade or knife. But the injuries associated with dismemberment allegedly required something much more powerful and mechanically suited for cutting through bone and tissue. That distinction matters because it expands the scope of what investigators are trying to prove. The prosecution does not merely need to establish that Celeste died violently. Prosecutors must ultimately demonstrate who caused the fatal injuries, who allegedly handled the body afterward, whether those acts were premeditated, and whether any tools connected to the crime can be tied directly to Burke or anyone associated with him. That is where Toolmark analysis becomes critical. According to forensic experts discussing the case publicly, investigators reportedly preserved portions of Celeste's ribs and other bone structures specifically for detailed examination by specialists trained in identifying marks left behind by cutting instruments. These analysts study microscopic patterns left by serrations, blades, saw teeth, and other surfaces that interact with bone during violent contact. In many homicide investigations, tool marks function almost like fingerprints. The process is highly technical. Bone surfaces are cleaned, sectioned, photographed, and examined microscopically. Analysts compare grooves, striations, and cut characteristics against known tool patterns to determine not only the type of instrument used, but sometimes even the individual tool itself. If prosecutors eventually identify a matching instrument connected to Burke or someone within his circle, the evidentiary impact could be devastating, and investigators may already be moving in that direction. Public discussions surrounding the case revealed that a chainsaw was reportedly found at the property associated with the investigation. However, analysts indicated there was no evidence the chainsaw itself had been used. That revelation immediately created another unanswered question. If the chainsaw was not involved, was another tool acquired separately? Experts discussing the evidence suggested possibilities ranging from manual saws to portable battery-operated cutting tools. And once again, the blue plastic fragments returned to the center of the mystery. Could they represent pieces from a handle, a guard, a housing component, a protective casing? Investigators have not publicly answered those questions, but analysts repeatedly emphasized that if the fragments are successfully identified, they may become one of the strongest pieces of physical evidence in the entire case. Because unlike testimony, microscopic trace evidence does not forget, panic, or change its story. As prosecutors appeared to strengthen their forensic narrative, the defense position also began taking clearer shape. One of the most important strategic developments emerging from court discussions involved the distinction between suspicion and proof. Defense attorneys and legal analysts repeatedly emphasized a core principle that often becomes blurred in emotionally charged investigations. Possession of remains does not automatically establish murder. That argument may become one of the central pillars of Burke's defense moving forward. According to legal commentators discussing the case publicly, the defense appears prepared to argue that prosecutors still must prove far more than proximity to the body. They must prove Burke inflicted the fatal wounds. They must prove he committed any alleged dismemberment. They must prove intent, premeditation, conscious action, and they must do so beyond a reasonable doubt. That burden is extraordinarily high by design. The justice system requires prosecutors not merely to create suspicion, but to eliminate reasonable alternative explanations. In many homicide cases, jurors may believe a defendant behaved suspiciously, yet still remain unconvinced about the exact sequence of events necessary for conviction on the most severe charges. This legal tension is precisely why the prosecution appears focused on constructing such a comprehensive evidence network. Because individually, many pieces of evidence can be challenged. Lyrics can be interpreted differently. Behavior can be explained. Emotional detachment is subjective. Even possession of incriminating objects may not establish murder on its own. But collectively, prosecutors may hope the evidence creates a narrative too overwhelming for jurors to ignore. And the evidence pool appears enormous. During court proceedings, prosecutors reportedly described the digital evidence involved in the case as massive in scale. Terabytes of material allegedly extracted from phones, iCloud accounts, social media platforms, and cellular records were still being turned over to the defense during procedural hearings. That amount of data suggests investigators conducted an extraordinarily broad digital reconstruction effort. Modern homicide investigations increasingly unfold through data analysis rather than eyewitness testimony alone. Smartphones record movement patterns. Cloud systems archive deleted material. Social media preserves communication timelines. Cellular records establish proximity. Search histories reveal interests and intentions. Photos carry metadata. Messaging applications preserve conversations people assume disappeared forever. Investigators now reconstruct lives digitally. And according to prosecutors, that reconstruction effort in this case appears extensive. The wiretap revelation remains one of the most important unanswered aspects of the investigation. Legal authorization for wire interception generally requires investigators to convince a judge that significant criminal communications are likely occurring and that traditional investigative methods are insufficient. That threshold is substantial. What prosecutors allegedly captured through the wiretap remains unknown publicly. But the fact that investigators pursued such measures strongly suggests they believed crucial conversations may have continued after Celeste's death. That possibility introduces an entirely different dimension to the case. Were investigators monitoring attempts to conceal evidence? Discussions between associates? Efforts to coordinate stories? Expressions of panic? Or conversations involving knowledge of the crime itself? At this stage, the public does not know, but the existence of the wiretap continues hanging over the investigation like a sealed chapter no one has yet been allowed to read. At the same time, another layer of evidence reportedly complicates the prosecution's narrative and emotional tone even further. Defensive wounds. According to the disclosed findings, Celeste allegedly sustained injuries consistent with attempts to fight back. Defensive wounds often become emotionally powerful evidence during homicide trials because they suggest conscious struggle, fear, resistance, and survival instinct during an attack. For jurors, such evidence can profoundly humanize victims while simultaneously intensifying perceptions of violence. The autopsy findings reportedly described additional disturbing details about the condition of Celeste's remains. Her skull was partially skeletonized. One eye was gone. Her pinky finger and ring finger were mutilated. She was reportedly found wearing a black tube top, similar to clothing visible in photographs associated with her relationship with Burke. Each of these details contributed to the increasingly disturbing portrait prosecutors appeared to be constructing. Toxicology findings also reportedly indicated the presence of MDMA and methamphetamine in her system. Toxicology evidence in homicide investigations can become highly contested because substances alone do not explain circumstances, consent, violence, or responsibility. But prosecutors and defense attorneys often interpret toxicology findings very differently depending on broader case strategy. Prosecutors may argue substances contributed to vulnerability or impaired judgment. Defense attorneys may argue toxicology complicates certainty regarding timelines, interactions, or witness interpretations. How this evidence will ultimately be presented in court remains unknown, but its inclusion further demonstrates the complexity of the prosecution's case. And then came one of the strangest developments yet. As online investigators and commentators continued examining the timeline surrounding Celeste's disappearance and death, a concert video surfaced that appeared to show a woman resembling Celeste in the audience at one of Burke's performances. The woman reportedly wore clothing similar to the black tube top associated with Celeste in prior images. The implication immediately ignited public speculation. If the footage was recorded after investigators believed Celeste had already died, what exactly was viewers were seeing? A coincidence? A mistaken identity? An unrelated audience member? Or something more deliberate? Importantly, prosecutors have not publicly confirmed any theory surrounding the footage, nor have they formally alleged an intentional attempt to create the impression Celeste remained alive. But the existence of the speculation itself became another powerful narrative force surrounding the case. Because true crime investigations often become psychologically driven by timeline disruption. Once people believe they may have seen a victim alive after an alleged death date, every assumption becomes unstable. Audiences begin questioning what investigators know, when they knew it, and whether attempts were made to manipulate public perception. At this stage, the footage remains an unresolved and highly speculative element of the broader public conversation. But its emergence significantly intensified online fascination with the case. While those questions unfolded publicly, Burke himself remained incarcerated under restrictive conditions. Reports surrounding his confinement indicated he was being housed in segregation within a correctional facility known for holding other notable inmates in high-profile cases. According to public discussions, Burke reportedly showered every other day and received limited phone privileges tied to those routines. Reports also suggested he had no money available in his commissary account. Those details may appear minor compared to the larger allegations in the case, but they serve an important narrative function in public understanding of criminal proceedings. High-profile defendants often exist in strange, dual realities. Outside the jail, investigators, prosecutors, media outlets, forensic analysts, and online communities obsessively analyze every detail connected to the allegations. Inside the jail, daily life becomes repetitive, isolated, and controlled by institutional routine. Meanwhile, the prosecution's case continues evolving outside the walls. Perhaps the most ominous development emerging from discussions around the investigation involved the possibility that associates connected to the case could eventually face their own legal jeopardy. Commentators discussing the prosecution strategy repeatedly referenced the idea that some individuals connected to Burke may ultimately be forced to decide whether they want to become witnesses or defendants. That statement carries enormous implications because it suggests investigators may believe other people possessed knowledge relevant to the alleged concealment, aftermath, or surrounding circumstances of Celeste's death. Whether prosecutors ultimately pursue additional charges remains unknown publicly, but the possibility alone dramatically widens the scale of the investigation. Suddenly, the case is no longer framed solely around one accused individual and one victim. Instead, it begins resembling a broader ecosystem of communications, relationships, decisions, and potential cooperation agreements. That is where wiretaps, digital records, and forensic timelines intersect. Modern prosecutions often rely heavily on pressure dynamics. Once investigators assemble enough evidence, individuals on the periphery of a case may begin reassessing their own exposure. Witnesses cooperate. Stories change. Phones get examined. Metadata contradicts statements. Group chats become evidence. Deleted material resurfaces. Prosecutors compare timelines against digital movement records minute by minute. And according to court discussions, investigators in this case may possess terabytes of exactly that kind of material. As the legal battle continues building toward future hearings, the defense remains positioned to challenge every stage of the prosecution's reconstruction. Legal analysts following the proceedings repeatedly emphasized that jurors will eventually need more than disturbing details. They will need proof connecting every major allegation to Burke directly and convincingly. That distinction remains essential, because no matter how emotionally disturbing a case becomes, criminal courtrooms operate on evidentiary standards, not outrage. Still, prosecutors appear increasingly confident in the scope of the evidence they have assembled. The body bag allegedly swabbed for DNA across multiple surfaces, the wiretap, the digital records, the trace plastic fragments, the Toolmark analysis, the defensive wounds, the autopsy findings, the potential purchase trails, the communications investigators allegedly recovered. Individually, each element raises questions. Together, prosecutors may argue they form a coherent and devastating narrative. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the investigation is how incomplete the public picture still appears to be. Every hearing has introduced new evidence. Every procedural update has expanded the known scope of the investigation. And every disclosure seems to imply investigators possess still more information that has not yet been revealed publicly. That is why this case continues holding such intense public attention, not simply because of the brutality alleged, but because the investigation feels unfinished, layered, expanding, a story still unfolding in real time. And somewhere inside that expanding evidence trail may be the final explanation for what happened to Celeste Rivas Hernandez during the final hours of her life. What investigators ultimately prove in court remains to be seen. What evidence jurors eventually hear remains unknown. What additional digital material prosecutors still possess remains unclear. And whether other individuals may eventually face scrutiny alongside Burke is still unresolved. But one thing is certain. The investigation into the death of Celeste Rivas Hernandez has moved far beyond a conventional homicide case. It has become a forensic puzzle involving microscopic evidence, digital reconstruction, psychological interpretation, competing legal narratives, and unanswered questions that continue multiplying with every new disclosure. And according to investigators, the full story may still not be public yet.